Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Jerry Friedman, co-chair of Elders Climate Action, and I'd like to welcome you to this, our monthly webinar. Tonight we are very fortunate and honored to have a special guest speaker speaking to us on climate change and communication, which is one of the stickier issues that we all face. So we're honored to have John Cook being able to provide a presentation for you tonight. He is a research assistant professor at the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University, obtained his PhD at the University of Western Australia, studying the cognitive psychology of climate science denial. His research focus is understanding and countering misinformation about climate change. In 2007, he founded Skeptical Science, a website which won the 2011 Australian Museum Eureka Prize for the Advancement of Climate Change Knowledge, and 2016 Friend of the Planet Award from the National Center for Science Education. John co-authored the college textbooks Climate Change, Examining the Facts, and Climate Change Science, A Modern Synthesis, and a book, Climate Change Denial, Heads in the Sand. In 2013, he published a paper finding 97% scientific consensus on human-caused global warming, a finding that has been highlighted by President Obama and UK Prime Minister David Cameron. So I'd like you to welcome John and listen to his presentation. Before he starts, I'd just like to let you know that we will be having a Q&A period at the end. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, you'll see a box that says Q&A. If you have any questions, put those questions in the Q&A box, and we will answer them as they come at the end of the presentation. The chat box is really just for Q&A. So please question the Q&A box, and welcome to John. Thank you so much for doing this presentation for us.
Thanks very much, Jerry. First things first, I think I've just shared my slides. Does it all look good? Excellent. Okay, so all right. Well, firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity and the invitation to talk. I very much appreciate it, and I think I just had a chat with Jerry just before before this talk, and she was describing all the amazing work that the Elders Climate Action Group is doing. So it's a great opportunity to talk to you all. Now, I thought I might just start by just giving you a little bit of context, because it'll probably help make more sense of my talk, just by describing a little bit about myself. Although I apologize for the long introduction that Jerry had to read. I hope it wasn't too long. So the work I do, there's really two elements to my work. One is researching how to communicate climate change more effectively. And I've published a number of studies, doing experiments, testing different ways to respond to misinformation and communicate climate change. And secondly, putting that into action, all that research, and actually communicating climate change. And part of that includes writing books and textbooks. The most recent was this textbook that I wrote with Dan Bedford at Weber State University in Utah, just explaining the science of climate change. But the one other thing I should mention was, before I went into academia, I was actually, I did cartooning for a living. And lately I've been experimenting with doing climate communication using cartoons. And so I'm just telling you that because you might see a few cartoons appear in today's slides, and you might be wondering what's going on here. So I want to talk about climate communication. How do we communicate more effectively? And I thought I might start with a cartoon, actually. And this is a quote from Ed Maybach, who's the director of the Center for Climate Change Communication, where I work. And his mantra, this saying that he says all the time, is, in order to more effectively communicate climate change, or more effectively communicate anything, the approach we need to take is simple, clear messages, repeated often from a variety of trusted voices. And he says it so often that I drew this cartoon, kind of making fun of him a little bit. Drawing cartoons of your boss is not always a wise thing to do, but I think I got away with it this time. But it really underscores just those three elements to effective communication. Boiling our messages down to simple messages, being willing to repeat them often. That is hard for scientists such as myself, because we get bored very easily and we want to move on to the next thing. But what the science of communication tells us is we need to be persistent and repetitive. And thirdly, messages need to come from a variety of different groups, different people, different messengers, whether it's elders or children or politicians or TV weathercasters or health professionals or cartoonists. Everyone has a voice, and they can all reach different audiences. And so developing simple messages and repeating them and from a variety of different people is the most effective way to get messages, to convey them, to penetrate into society. So then I guess the next question is, what are those simple messages? What do we need to be communicating about climate change? And at George Mason University, my colleagues have been researching this for many years. They've been conducting lots of surveys and experiments that explore how people think about climate change and all the different types of beliefs that people have. And they've managed to boil them down to really, there's just 5 key things that people believe about climate change that really matter. And they call them the 5 key climate beliefs. And you can summarize them with just 10 words. It's real, global warming is happening. It's us, humans are causing global warming, we're the dominant cause. It's bad, the impacts will be and are being felt throughout society, around the world, but also us here now. The experts agree, climate scientists agree on the science that humans are causing global warming. And lastly, there is hope. We have solutions. We have all the technology we need to solve climate change. We just need the political will, and we need to act. And so ultimately, climate change is complicated. Climate science is super complicated. But the key things that people need to believe can be boiled down to these 5 key beliefs, these simple 10 words. And I think you could even boil it down simpler. If you got on an elevator and you had like 2 floors to explain climate change to someone, then if you had one thing that you had to say to people, I would focus on the 4th point. Experts agree. And in fact, just a single number, 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming. We've done a whole range of studies testing this message. And what we found is that what people think about expert opinion is a gateway belief. By that, I mean that when people come to realize that the experts agree on climate change, this has all these flow-on effects. It influences their acceptance that climate change is happening and that it's bad. And then most importantly, it influences people's support for climate action. And so communicating the 97% consensus not only increases or improves people's attitudes about climate change, it also increases their support for climate action as well. So that's a very brief summary of some of the key points of climate communication. The problem is that not only are there people like myself or Ed Maybach who are communicating best practices, communicating the research on how to more effectively communicate climate change, there are also similar people who are giving similar talks on how to delay climate action. What are the key messages that opponents of climate action could use to reduce public support for climate action? And here's an example of one of the key figures that are doing exactly that. This is a photo of Frank Luntz. He's kind of the anti-Ed Maybach. He's a communication expert, and he advises Republicans on how to further or develop increased public support for conservative policies, such as delaying climate action or continuing to burn fossil fuels, I guess, or not make that transition to clean sources of energy. And what's the key message, or what's the communication technique that Frank Luntz advocates? This is it. To effectively get a message across, you just say it over and over and over again until you're sick to death of saying it. And then, only then, people are hearing the message for the first time, which kind of echoes what Ed Maybach was saying about repeat it often. We need to be persistent with our messaging. The only problem is Frank Luntz is using these techniques to reduce public support for climate action. So what are the messages that climate deniers are presenting to the public? I've been doing some content analysis with some colleagues in England, Travis Cohen and Konstantin Bousalis. And what we found was, when we looked at all the different arguments that climate deniers argue, they can be boiled down to these 5 categories. And the 5 categories are: it's not real, it's not us, it's not bad, you can't trust experts, and there's no hope, we can't solve climate change. And it was kind of striking when our research arrived at this list, because it's like the opposite world. It's the polar opposite of the 5 climate beliefs. So we term them the 5 climate disbeliefs. And what is the main message that they focus on amongst these 5 messages? We found that the main thing that they focus on is confusing the public about expert consensus. Back to Frank Luntz, the Republican strategist, there was a famous memo that came out in 2002, or that was leaked in 2002. And in it, Frank Luntz basically, he was providing communication advice to Republicans who were trying to win the public debate about climate policy. In other words, to try to maintain the status quo as far as climate policy goes. And he said that if you want to win the policy debate about climate change, what you need to do is basically confuse the public about the expert scientific consensus. If the public think that all the climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming, then their attitudes will change and they'll support climate action. But if you keep the public confused about expert consensus, then you win the policy debate. And he was right. Like, he, in 2002, had already figured out that what the public think about expert consensus is a gateway belief. And if you can confuse the public about that, then their support for climate action goes down. So what happens when the public are exposed to misinformation about climate change or misinformation about the consensus? We've tested that at George Mason University as well. And I won't get too big on the graphs in this talk, but I find that this graph is just so instructive. What they did in this experiment was they presented 2 different types of information to the public, either the 97% consensus or misinformation casting doubt on the consensus. And what they found was, the first bar on the left, when people were presented information about the 97% consensus, their acceptance of climate change went up, their support for climate change went up. But the second bar shows what happens when they were presented with misinformation about consensus. Everything went down. So this is kind of what you would expect. Facts increase people's knowledge, misinformation decreases people's knowledge. But the third bar here, or that third very thin blue line, is what happened when people were presented with both types of information, fact and misinformation. And what they found was the 2 cancelled each other out. There was no net effect. It was just cancelled out. And so what's happening in this situation is people are being presented with two conflicting pieces of information, and they have no way of determining which is true and which is false. And when that happens, they disengage. They just stop believing in either. This is the real danger of misinformation and fake news. It's not necessarily, the biggest danger isn't necessarily that it makes people believe wrong things. The biggest danger, I think, is that it can cancel out accurate information and just stop people believing in facts. What's happening is when people are presented with these facts and myths together, these conflicting pieces of information, it's a bit like those old Star Trek episodes where Captain Kirk gets cloned and Mr. Spock has to try to figure out which is the real Kirk and which is the fake Kirk. The public have that same dilemma when it comes to facts and misinformation. And if they can't discern which is true and which isn't, then they just don't believe either. So what we need to do as communicators, as people talking about climate change, as people who might encounter misinformation or encounter climate deniers, is we need to help people resolve that conflict between fact and myth. We have to help them like Spock working out the real Kirk and the fake Kirk. We have to help people work out which is true and which is false. And the way they did it in this experiment that my colleagues at Mason ran was they basically inoculated people before showing them the misinformation. And by inoculation, what I mean is when people get vaccinated, they get exposed to a weak form of a disease. And that helps them build up immunity so that when they encounter the actual disease, they don't get infected. They've developed a resistance to the disease. Now, psychology researchers have found that exactly the same thing happens with misinformation. When you expose people to a weak form of misinformation, they build up immunity. And then when they encounter the actual misinformation, it doesn't influence them. What I mean by a weak form of misinformation is explaining the techniques that the misinformation use to mislead. When it's a bit like showing how a magician does their trick, but saying, well, they put their card out that sleeve at this point and they distract you with their other hand at this other point. When you explain this to people and they see how the magician does the trick, then they're no longer deceived by the magic trick. And inoculation does the same thing with misinformation. So what my colleagues found in their research was that when you explain the techniques of misinformation, the fallacies in climate myths, and when people understand how they might be misled, those myths, that misinformation no longer misleads them. They've become inoculated. So the next question then is, how do we do that? How do we inoculate? How do we explain the techniques of climate misinformation to people? And the answer comes from critical thinking. And the reason why I love critical thinking is because essentially it's like X-ray vision into thinking. Let me explain what I mean by that. So here is a example of a climate myth taken from the 2016 primaries. We're actually about to enter the 2020 primaries, I think tomorrow night, right, is what the first debate. So back when they were having the Republican debates 4 years ago, Marco Rubio was asked a question about climate change, and his answer was this, that the reason why climate is changing now is because climate has always been changing. And if you watch the video of this, the room erupts into a rapturous applause at that argument. And so it can be quite a convincing argument, or if you're not convinced by it, you might think something wrong about that argument, but I'm not sure exactly what. What critical thinking allows you to do is deconstruct arguments like this in order to find out whether there's anything misleading in that argument. Are there any fallacies in the logic? And what I mean by deconstructing an argument is dividing an argument into its starting assumptions or premises and its conclusion. Every argument ultimately takes that structure. And if by breaking it up into its different premises and conclusion, that allows you to surgically identify, is there anywhere in this argument where it's logically flawed? Are there any logical fallacies or false assumptions? In this case, the argument is jumping to conclusions, otherwise known as a non sequitur. Non sequitur being Latin for it does not follow. The conclusion does not follow from the starting assumptions. Just because something has changed naturally before doesn't mean that it has to be natural now. And so some of the work I've done has been use this critical thinking approach to deconstruct all the most common climate myths and identify any fallacies in each one. And once you have those fallacies, you can explain them to people and inoculate them against the misinformation. Basically explain to people how the myth distorts the facts. And once they know that, then they can reconcile that conflict between fact and myth. Now, going through this logical process of deconstructing and identifying fallacies is an onerous task, and not everyone is going to have the time to do it or the desire to do it. And so I've also been exploring with, well, what are other ways that you can explain the fallacies in misinformation and inoculate people? I've been exploring the approach of parallel arguments, which is the process of taking some flawed logic and transplanting it into absurd situations and using the exact same logic in this absurd situation. And what that does is people can easily and humorously see exactly how an argument is logically flawed. And it's something you can do without even having to necessarily explain all the science behind it. I mean, if we can have the opportunity to explain the science, that's always the ideal situation. But while we were doing this critical thinking research, I realized that this approach of parallel arguments was a technique used by late night comedians every night. They would take statements by public figures, misinformation, stupid, logically flawed statements, and they would, rather than do a big scientific explanation or do a big logical deconstruction, they would say, public figure said this, well, that's just like being in this situation and saying that. And everyone laughs. They can instantly see that it's a logically flawed, ridiculous argument. And they've been inoculated against that particular statement, that particular form of misinformation. So I think I'm hoping to leave lots of time for questions, but I wanted to finish with just a few resources that we've developed that might be useful to you if you ever get in a situation where you talk about climate change with people and there's a possibility that you might encounter misinformation or climate denier arguing something, and you want to know how to respond. What we developed was a massive open online course, a MOOC, a free online course, that looked at the 50 of the most common myths about climate change and explained the fallacy in each of those myths. And the way we did that was we actually created about 50 short 7-minute videos. Each video is about a particular climate fact, but then we look at a related climate myth. I talked before about fact and myth and these conflicting pieces of information. What we do is we present the fact, then we present the myth, and then we help resolve the conflict between the two by explaining the fallacy that the myth commits to distort the facts. And so basically it's like 50 inoculations, 50 flu shots. against the most common myths about climate change. And if you go to that web address at the top of the screen, sks.to/FMF, what you'll see is all the myths, all the fallacies, all summarized in this one neat place. And also all the videos are embedded. So if you want to watch the 7-minute videos, you can watch them right there on that page. So it's a great resource, if you want to just become more informed about climate change and how to respond to climate myths. But it also is a great resource if you hear a myth and you're looking for an answer, you can jump to this page and see what the science says. And lastly, the next thing I just wanted to briefly mention was, this is more of a preview of something that's coming up. What we're currently working on is a mobile game that does all the same things that I've just been talking about, inoculating people against the techniques of denial, explaining all the different fallacies in climate misinformation, but in the form of a game. Rather than me passively explain it to people, people can learn about the techniques of denial by actually playing it and learning it interactively themselves. And so that we're going to be testing that in classes at George Mason and other universities in the fall semester. So it'll be interesting to see how effective that is. It's an approach called active inoculation. Like everything I've talked about up to this point has been passive inoculation, where you're explaining techniques of denial and people are passively receiving that information. Active inoculation should be even more effective because people are actively engaging with the content. But we'll know that for sure in a few months. So I'd be happy to answer any of your questions from this point, and thank you again for the invitation to talk.
Thank you so much, John. That was great. So we have some questions. First question is in terms of language. So I noticed that you use global warming, and is that the language that you feel is the most effective versus climate change or climate crisis?
I personally tend to use them interchangeably. I know there's a lot of debate over which term is the best to use. I don't think it makes a huge difference either way. I mentioned Frank Luntz before, that Republican strategist. He actually advised Republicans to use the term climate change rather than global warming, because global warming is more threatening and climate change just seems like a more benign term. And so from the point of view of someone trying to reduce public concern about climate change, he was advising use the term climate change, which, you know, my kind of rule of thumb is whatever Frank Luntz recommends, do the opposite. But I mean, more seriously, I like the term global warming because it very simply describes what's happening, which is that our planet is building up heat. The planet is currently accumulating heat at a rate of 250 trillion joules per second, which is equivalent to 4 atomic bombs of heat every second. That's how much heat is building up in our climate system. And so I think that communicating just that physical reality of our planet warming, of global warming, is important. So yeah, I don't think that personally, I don't think that the terminology is crucially important. It's more those underlying concepts that we need to communicate.
Thank you. There's another question, which I'll read to you while you're turning off your screen share.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
What is the most common myth you tend to see?
It depends on how you look at it, but I would say I mentioned before how we've done this content analysis of the 5 different types of climate denial categories, and the most common category by far was attacking scientists or attacking the science. So it wasn't about arguing scientific explanations for what alternative causes of global warming. It wasn't even arguing different policy arguments. Mostly climate deniers are trying to just reduce public trust in scientists, reduce public trust in climate data, and increase uncertainty. We've even seen that over the last few years with statements from the administration. They've kind of moved away from global warming is not happening, and now it's more, we don't know how much humans are contributing. There's too much uncertainty. So I think that's uncertainty arguments, and even just simply attacking scientists, attacking their motives, or attacking the veracity of models or climate data is the most common thing. And so one subset of those is attacking the consensus, which is why it's important that we do communicate the 97% consensus.
Great, thank you. Some more questions. What have you learned about the needs of people who are denying climate change? And do you have a sense of what motivates them?
Yeah, so there was a great meta-analysis done by some of my Australian colleagues from the University of Queensland, where I was based before I moved to the US. And Matthew Hornsey was the lead author. And what they did was they did a survey of surveys. They looked at all the different surveys of climate beliefs and what was driving them. And then they just pulled it all together. And what they found was the biggest driver of climate attitudes, and in other words, the biggest reason why people deny climate change by far was political affiliation. It was more important than age, gender, income, even education level, even science literacy. Political affiliation was much stronger than all of those. And so basically people's attitudes about the greenhouse effect and the carbon cycle and climate science and climate change is driven by who we vote for, what tribe we belong to. It didn't always be further and further apart over time, and misinformation is one of the big drivers of that. But yeah, just particularly in the last few years, I've become really aware of just how tribal the issue is now. And one of the, so that kind of leads you to despair, like, well, how do we penetrate those kind of echo chambers and those bubbles? One thing I found in my own research was this approach of inoculation, this idea of explaining to people how they might be misled. I found that it was actually the most effective with political conservatives because they were the most vulnerable to misinformation. And so, in other words, across the political spectrum, no one wants to be misled. Nobody wants to be tricked. And so explaining in general terms the techniques used to trick people can make a more resilient population, more resilient to misinformation.
Thank you, thank you. Here is a question. Now that you're full-time at George Mason, who's picked up the Skeptical Science website?
So I've been full-time academic for nearly a decade now. So, but Skeptical Science is kind of like where research into climate communication ends and where Skeptical Science begins is kind of a bit of a grey area, because it's Skeptical Science is really the application of all the research. But in terms of who, Skeptical Science now isn't just a single person running a blog. It's a whole team of people, volunteers from all around the world. And it's been that way for a number of years. And so, yeah, it's really a team effort. There's a whole bunch of us all not only writing content, but reviewing each other's content, making it as rigorous and accurate as possible, as well as strong, as well communicated as possible as well. And so I think if you go sks.to/team, you'll see all the people who contribute to the site. Yeah, so we're very blessed to have a whole range of volunteers from all around the world.
I think Jerry may have froze.
Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
it does look like she froze, so I'm going to go ahead and take over and maybe she'll come back. So my apologies, everybody. Hi, I'm Jen. Um, let's see. One of the questions was, how about, and I think what they're referring to is, how about the term climate crisis? What are your thoughts on the terminology we use?
I mean, it's an accurate term. Like, we are in a crisis, and I think that the situation is becoming more and more dire. Like, those invisible lines where we go over tipping points, and we're committing ourselves irrevocably to the collapse of the Greenland ice sheet or the West Antarctica ice sheet. It's like we're driving towards this cliff in a fog, and we don't know whether we've gone over them or not. So certainly, I think it's accurate to talk about a crisis. The question is whether it's good communication or not. And there is some research showing that when our rhetoric becomes too hyperbolic, that can alienate audiences or people. And so we do have to kind of tread this line between communicating the reality of the situation, which is a very dire, scary situation, without alienating people. And I think that just level-headed explanation of the science um, um, should do that. I don't think we need to get hyperbolic, but I also don't think that climate crisis is hyperbolic. I think that we explain it to people without getting too excited, we can still communicate the magnitude of the problem. But on the other hand, also there's also that danger of being too level-headed as well. I think that as someone in the scientific community, what we struggle with is letting our humanity show. We try to be so objective that we're robots, and the public are thinking, you're explaining this climate stuff, and the words you're saying, we're in an emergency, this is an existential crisis, and yet you're just explaining it in dry, dispassionate scientific terms. So I think that the challenge for us as scientists is also to kind of tread that tightrope of explaining it, letting our humanity show without alienating audiences.
I think that's a really great point. Does it ever help to ask people how they imagine climate change affecting their region?
Yes, I think that's a really good question. One of the big challenges with people's attitudes about climate change is psychological distance. And there are 4 types of psychological distance. There's spatial, thinking that climate change is happening somewhere far away from us. It's happening in the Arctic or in the Antarctic or Australia or Africa or somewhere. Temporal, it's going to happen to our grandchildren, but it's not going to affect me personally. Hypothetical, which is that it might happen, but it might not, that idea of uncertainty that I was talking about earlier. And cultural, that it's happening to people who are different to me. It's not happening to my society, where I live. And what we need to communicate to people is communicate the impacts of climate change in a way that close all of those types of psychological distance. Help people to understand that climate change is happening here and now. Like I moved to Virginia, and in the first few weeks that I got here, I went down to Virginia Beach, and they were showing me areas where the floods come up through the drains on a weekly basis. They showed me the millions of dollars spent raising a road because it was prone to flooding. And there are examples of climate impacts like this all around America, whether it's bushfires in California or sea level rise encroachment in Florida, and all many different other impacts in the rest of the country. And one of the key impacts that people just don't realize in a big way yet are the health impacts of climate change. and climate change impacts human health in a range of different ways. That's one of the things that we've been doing at the Centre for Climate Change Communication is partnering with medical associations and doctors and nurses and health professionals in trying to communicate the health impacts of climate change, because that is something that everyone cares about, is the health of their family, of their community. And so it's a very bipartisan way to communicate climate change.
Did you happen to catch the article in yesterday's USA Today about the health effects of climate change?
I haven't seen that, but I do know that just over the last day or two that the Health Consortium, which is one of the organisations at our group, have been they've been trying to pull together all these associations and have a call to action on the health impacts of climate change. So it could have been connected to that. And
I would guess that it had some impact, because I did see some media coverage of it yesterday. So it seems like the cry hit the airwaves, if you will.
And what's informed our approach is really that mantra from Ed Maybank: simple, clear messages repeated often from a variety of trusted sources. So we're trying to communicate that simple message that climate change is affecting us where it hurts the most, our health. And we've been banging that drum for a while now, and it's just starting to, it seems people are starting to take notice. And we're trying to do it from a variety of trusted sources, as in we have, I think we have at last count about 76 different organizations, health organizations and associations, all helping to send that message to their communities.
Yes, thank you. We have one of our listeners says, I like to use the ODP problem as a parallel argument. It was identified as real, actions taken, and good results followed. What is missing now seems to be the increase of miscommunication and certainly the lack of leadership at a political level. What can we do?
What's ODP? Sorry, could you enlighten me?
I'm gonna guess ozone.
Oh, okay.
ODP.
Ozone depletion, right?
Yeah, it's maybe.
Yeah, I mean, if that's what they mean, I mean that's a really powerful analogy, because basically scientists raised the warning that the ozone layer was being depleted and it was caused by human activity, and we needed to change what we were emitting into the atmosphere in order to avoid this existential problem of UV radiation coming and affecting human health. And society put a price on maybe I'm confusing my issues, but certainly we cut down on that pollution, and the ozone layer began recovering. So like it's also a much easier problem to solve, in that energy pervades every part of society. It's a much bigger, more intractable problem, but certainly it's a good analogy. The other analogy I find really powerful and relevant is the tobacco industry. The health impacts of smoking and the misinformation campaigns waged by the tobacco industry to confuse the public about the harmful impacts of their product. That's perfectly analogous to what the fossil fuel industry is doing now. Their product is hurting people, and they are misinforming, they are funding misinformation to confuse the public about how harmful their product is. And to further that analogy, just as tobacco scientists working for the tobacco industry knew how harmful their product was before they started misinforming people, similarly, scientists working for the fossil fuel industry knew about the science of climate change as early as the 80s or sooner. But then after the scientists briefed them about the health or the impacts of climate change from fossil fuel burning, they went on to misinform the public. I think I've kind of wandered away from the original intent of that question, though. I forget what they were exactly asking. I'm sorry.
I think it was a very interesting roundabout answer. It was basically, they were basically asking, do you have any suggestions of what we can do to sort of manage this miscommunication and then also the lack of leadership that we're seeing? Is there any advice or any recommendations you might have of things that we can do to take action or to change that behavior, change those communications, change the lack of leadership?
I'm really glad they asked that question and that you repeated it, because I missed it the first time. Because one thing I forgot to say earlier, which is probably one of the most important things I think that needs to be said in the context of climate communication, is the most important thing that any of us, I think, can do to contribute to climate action is break climate silence. 51% of the US public are either concerned or alarmed about climate change. Most of the public are on board with climate change, but most of those people who are alarmed or concerned don't talk about climate change with their friends and families. And so climate silence is this big problem. Because people aren't talking about it, they don't realize that there's broad acceptance of the science of climate change, and broad acceptance of the reality of climate change. So what we need to do, more than anything, is break climate silence by, firstly, talking to friends and families and our social networks, and secondly, letting public officials know that we care about this issue and we vote accordingly. If enough people speak to their public, like elected officials, about climate change, you'll magically find that politicians will start caring about it and acting on it as well. And so I think one of the big disconnects between what the public think and eventual climate action is climate silence. We're not talking enough to our elected officials, or even to each other, and just building that momentum and that conversation. And if we can build enough social momentum and political momentum, then we'll see real action.
And I think what you just said in your answer really is really what Elders Climate Action is all about. We're about making sure that the voice of elders is out there in the fight against climate change, and really that to show that elders really want to see action on climate change, not only for their grandchildren, but for future generations and for all life. And that, we are committed to righting the wrongs that happen within the lifetimes that we've lived. And so I think that really just reiterates why we're here. And I think, we have a lot of, I'll answer this with a little bit of an ECA actions you can take. We have letter writing opportunities that we'll be sending you a call script to support our efforts while we're in Washington. July 10th through the 12th, we'll be in Washington delivering our message to members of Congress. And if you are unable to join us in DC, you can participate by sending letters while we're there, using our call script to make calls to your members of Congress, looking at ways that you can get engaged in your own community, getting engaged in September's Week of Action, which will be September 20th through 27th, looking at climate strikes and other activities that will be happening in your area during that Week of Action, and finding out what you can do to be involved or to support it, whether that's supporting things with your time or your talents, or supporting things with your dollars. I think the climate movement is best achieved when we're a movement of movements. And so Elders Climate Action is really a movement of elders out there in the bigger, broader context of a much larger climate movement. And we want to make sure that we're looking at an intergenerational movement, because it's going to take all of us. It's going to take all generations. So interacting with youth in your area, interacting with parent organizations in your area, and other elder organizations, and then organizations like our friends at Citizens Climate Lobby and 350.org. These are all wonderful ways to take action in your community. And you can always be Elders Climate Action or represent Elders Climate Action while doing those things. So, so I encourage everybody to really look out there and see what's in your own area, and then watch for Elders Climate Action Bulletins. We're constantly giving you things that you can do and take action, ways to take action, new letters that you can send, new call scripts that you can use, and other suggestions. So keep an eye on your email. Let's see, there's a couple more questions here. And
I feel like anything after that would be an anticlimax, but I'm happy to answer more questions.
well, thank you. I feel like that after following everything that you've said tonight. So one other point, okay, so a question of Tim from Houston. Tim is a good buddy of ours. Hi, Tim. He says, speaking of Dyer, what do you think of Deep Adaptation by Jim Bendel? Are you familiar with Deep Adaptation?
No, I'm not.
Okay, and then another, and maybe that will be a recommendation. Maybe Tim will recommend reading Deep Adaptation by Jim Bendel.
I'll put a note to look at.
John also was wondering if you had read the article that was recently posted on the Skeptical Science and Elders Climate Action Facebook pages today, How to Debate a Science Denier by Diana Kwan from Scientific American. Have you had a chance to read that article?
I have read it, and in fact, I'm quoted in it. I was interviewed by Diana in the writing of that article. So, was there a specific question about the article, or just?
No, he's just wondering if you've read it. So,
yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I'll just briefly talk about it because it's very relevant to everything I've just talked about tonight. It's an article about some new research that was published from Germany, and it's actually done by people. Science denial in health areas such as vaccination denial in Europe, which is a big issue apparently. But all those same principles apply to climate change as well. And in fact, they did a little bit of research into climate denial. What they tested was how do we respond to science denial and misinformation. And there are a couple of different ways that they tested. One was explaining the science in response to a myth. And another way was explaining the techniques of denial, which is what I mainly talked about tonight. And in fact, the fallacies that they used in their experiments were the same fallacies that I use in my work as well. And what they found was both approaches are almost equally effective. Explaining the science or explaining the techniques of denial, both are effective in neutralizing misinformation. And so the conclusion they came to was, A, it means that people can be comfortable responding to science misinformation in different ways. So for example, a scientist might want to talk about all the science, but someone like me who is more expert in the techniques of denial and logic and critical thinking can go that other route. But what I really like about this study was how they concluded. They said that, okay, yeah, using the science works, it's great, but using the techniques of, explaining the techniques of denial is especially powerful because it, every scientific topic has its own, its own unique science misinformation, but all the different techniques of denial are seen in every area of science denial, whether it's vaccination denial or climate denial or denying that smoking causes cancer or creationism. They all use these same techniques. So if you inoculate people against one technique, it potentially works for any type of science misinformation, not just a specific topic. So they did recommend that this was an especially powerful and impactful way of responding to misinformation.
Excellent. I'm excited to read it. I'll have to go on the Elders Climate Action Facebook page or our Skeptical Science Facebook page and check that one out.
I tweeted about it as well. So if you go twitter.com/John F.O. Cook, you also see a link to it.
Wonderful. Well, we are definitely getting to the end of the hour here, and I really appreciate everything that you've shared with us today. This has been a very illuminating conversation for myself, and I'm sure for a number of our listeners. I think I've just seeing comments and things come through. I think people are very interested by this subject matter. And we appreciate your time and everything that you're doing to help us understand how to communicate about climate action. So to all of us out there listening tonight, I hope that we heed some of the advice from John and go out there and try to communicate and enhance our communications with people in our communities and make a better world for ourselves, our grandchildren, future generations, and all life. Jerry had an internet issue. Her internet went down, so my apologies for that little disruption in our call, but it was nice to jump in and join you all tonight. And again, thank you so much, John.
Thank you for organizing this, and thank you also for just jumping in and seamlessly keeping things going. It was we didn't miss a beat.
My pleasure. Thank you. Everybody have a great evening.